Hi, my name is Scott Johnston. I'm a professor at Southern Cross University, and this talk is a repeat of a keynote presentation that I provided on the last day of the New South Wales Coastal Conference that was held in Ballina in November 2025. I'm going to try and stick to the original script as closely as possible so that this talk will be a true reflection of the original that was given that day. So I'd like to acknowledge country and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'll begin with an anecdote from about 32 years ago, back in 1993, when I attended the third New South Wales Coastal Conference in Port Macquarie. And I was a fresh graduate straight out of a Bachelor of Applied Science in Natural Resource Management, Coastal Management. And it was the first conference that I'd ever been to. So I remember going to all the talks, I was all wide-eyed and bushy-tailed. But as the week progressed, I remember feeling increasingly unsettled. Like this week, there was lots of really good people doing really good things in the environmental space, but it was also highly siloed, and it was clear that if this is what we were doing at a global scale, it lacked the speed and the scale to address the magnitude of the systemic global challenges that had already been pretty well identified by the early 1990s. And it was on the very last day while I was listening to Professor Bruce Tom's very engaging keynote talk that I was struck by a powerful, if somewhat embryonic thought that was something like this. We are highly unlikely to solve the environmental and ecological crises that we face by using the same patterns and frameworks of thinking that created the crisis in the first place. And over time, I put that aside as the idealistic musings of youth, but in more recent times, I've circled back to think that perhaps there's an important kernel of truth in that thought. And so in some ways, this talk is a riff off that theme. It's philosophical, and it offers a reflection on coastal management and catchment management placed in this really big picture global context. I'm going to draw on 30 years worth of observations in the natural resource management field, but also on insights and perspectives from earth sciences, from economics, from complex systems theory, philosophy, anthropology, deep ecology, and I'll probably throw in a little bit of culture, religion and politics as well. Now, some of what I say may resonate. Much might be familiar and you may have heard before. Some of it might provoke, but what it won't do is provide clear answers. My hope is that it might stimulate some uncomfortable questions and conversations about some really important big picture topics that we tend to avoid, particularly in public, and we tend to avoid them because they're difficult and because they can seem overwhelming and because they can upset our unseen assumptions about the world and our place in it. So this talk has 5 parts. I'm going to begin by looking at where we're at. What does it mean to be alive at the pointy end of the Anthropocene? A fair warning, this bit won't be unicorns and rainbows, but it's pretty important context. Then I'd like to talk briefly about our roles and what is it that we do, particularly in that context. And then I'll move on to talking about barriers to adoption. Why is it that we struggle so much to adopt at scale what we already know we need to do? And this is a juicy bit where I'm going to explore at least a little bit some of the ideas, thoughts and beliefs that underlie these barriers. Then I'm going to gaze briefly into the crystal ball and touch on some of the challenges that we might face in the coming decades ahead before finally wrapping up with no answers. But perhaps a few thoughts and some basic principles to consider as we try as individuals and a community of practitioners to navigate the years that lay ahead with a modicum of sanity and hopefully some efficacy. So, where are we at? Well, if I was to summarise this section of the talk in 2 words, it would be not pretty. Humanity is sleepwalking into an existential crisis of our own making. We're in the midst of a collision with the limits to growth. These are limits that are set by the laws of ecology and thermodynamics in the context of a finite planet. And in one sense, you could say it's a collision with the reality that we are indivisibly interwoven into the fabric of this world, and we can't undermine and diminish its integrity and function without also undermining and diminishing ourselves. And in some ways, this chart here, human population over the last 12,000 years, really sums up this section of the talk.
This rapid, incredibly rapid surge in human population has absolutely no precedent. It's our most successful and our most affluent period as a species, bar none. But there's no such thing as a free lunch in thermodynamics. And when looking at this chart, it's really hard to overemphasize the role of easily available energy during this period, because without the stored chemical energy of fossil hydrocarbons, this curve would have been impossible. And all of us here and listening to this talk have grown up in an energy excess that is so pervasive, it's become like wallpaper. We hardly even notice it. Yet for most of humanity's 300,000 year plus history, to create, to produce, build, farm, hunt, basically do anything, depended almost exclusively on human manual labour. More recently, that of domesticated animals, with a little bit of mechanical wind and water and heat from fire. But a single barrel of oil, with over 1,700 kilowatts of stored energy, contains the equivalent of 12 years of a single human being's entire manual labour physical work output at 40 hours per week. So this means that for us as Australians, using on average 17 barrels of oil per capita, this is the equivalent to each and every one of us having 204 personal energy slaves working for us, 40 hours a week, every week. And that explains the affluence. It also helps explain why it's so hard to give it up. But not noticing this energy abundance because it's become like wallpaper and in the background and we're all sort of swimming in it, that doesn't shield us from the consequences of the global carbon pulse that it has unleashed, which is truly geological in scale. And it's access to this energy that has allowed us to hoover up the stored ecological wealth of the biosphere in ways previously unimaginable, to create a mass of human-made materials, concrete, steel, asphalt and plastic that's now greater than that of the world's entire biomass, to diminish wild mammalian biomass to less than 4% of total, while the remaining 96% is made up of us, our livestock and our pets. And even though there's been a massive uptake of renewable energy in the last few years, which is fantastic, thus far it has not replaced fossil hydrocarbons. It's merely been in addition to. So we are yet to bend the curve. And so in the last 30 odd years, since I attended that third coastal conference in Port Macquarie, we collectively have consumed more energy and more materials than all humans before us combined. Now, you don't need to be a genius to figure out that that rate of consumption and extraction is just not sustainable. We are currently in a wild ecological overshoot and in the process of exceeding multiple planetary boundaries. Some of our brightest minds and top global organisations are telling us pretty much unequivocally that we are destabilising multiple key Earth systems that help keep our home stable and habitable, from upending and forcing our climate system and cryosphere, altering ocean atmosphere circulation patterns, acidifying oceans, collapsing biodiversity, radically altered nutrient cycles, et al. The present global crises are deep, they are interconnected, and they risk cascading over critical tipping points. Now, none of this is news, but it's really hard to look at, and it's harder still to truly digest. Yet, in some ways, we've known since the late 1960s and 70s that without systemic changes to business as usual, that this, or something like this, was the likely trajectory. The population and resource use J-curves don't tend to end well. And so given that we're in overshoot, with the buffers and lag times diminishing, profound civilizational change and a transition of some sort is basically inevitable. A key question is whether that transition is by design, or by disaster, or by just something in between. It's really not a question of if, it's a question of when and how. And so here we are in 2025. The development and advances in integrative earth science and natural sciences over the past 50 years has enabled us to begin to understand for the very first time how the Earth and the biosphere work as a complex set of self-regulating, nested systems, cycling matter and energy and maintaining a habitable world over long timescales. Now, key insights from these integrative sciences are quite new in terms of Western civilization and culture. And I would argue they remain collectively undigested. They haven't yet properly sunk into our culture, our stories, our politics and economics, and in part because they challenge some long-held views and beliefs. Now, if I was to try to summarize some of the core insights from these integrative natural sciences that focus on understanding the Earth as a complex system, it would be twofold. The first I would frame as deep interdependence, where all aspects of the geosphere, atmosphere, hydrosphere and biosphere are continually interlinked and connected through cycles that operate at different scales in space and time. And the second is kind of a spin-off of the first one, and it's what I'll call radical porosity, where the living skin of the planet, or the critical zone, including all of the organisms within it, you and me, are open systems, where matter and energy exchange continually across porous system boundaries. Boundaries that are, in many senses, mere convention only. Now, there is distinction, and there are relative boundaries, but those boundaries are hyperporous. And when you look closely for separate things, what you find is connection. You find flux and exchange. The material world flows through us quite literally. Studies of isotopic exchange of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen indicate that around about 98% of the atoms in our bodies by mass are replaced over the course of a single year. It varies with the tissues and the atoms, of course, but that's about the figure. Now, this open flow, this is why all of us listening to this have measurable PFAS in our blood, microplastics in our major organs, and atomic bomb C14 in our teeth and bones. And it's here, right here, where some of our deepest science aligns with what First Nations the world over know and have not forgotten, and that is, there is no external nature that's somehow separate from us. We live inside it, and it's one seamless, radically open and integrated whole. In fact, you could say that this mistaken idea that the natural world is one thing and that we humans are another, this idea of humans versus nature, it's that itself that lies at the very heart of our self-induced existential crisis. That one incorrect notion of separation has led to a civilization whose behaviour is at odds with its own foundations. So what is it that we are trying to do in catchment management? In many ways, our roles are a direct product of these times. Natural resource managers and environmental scientists are a pretty recent invention, and roles that arise from a recognition that there's an imbalance in the way that we humans interact with our broader environment. Now, you could argue that our jobs are basically meant to help our society address its misalignment with biophysical reality, to help nudge us to realign with ecological principles. But when you step back and take a look, our roles are kind of a little bit bonkers. And so society has created these roles to help mitigate the self-generated ecological and environmental consequences of our collective actions, but without really addressing the underlying causes that drive those actions. Now, if that doesn't qualify as a band-aid, I'm not quite sure what does. And so it's little wonder that we really struggle to implement. Despite our best efforts to effect meaningful change and to implement the types of solutions that we know will help us address these issues, it can genuinely feel like one step forward and two step backwards, or like spinning wheels amongst layers of institutional, legal, political and bureaucratic spaghetti. Why is it that we as a society are so skilled at developing report after report that scientifically quantifies environmental problems, develops solutions and works up a strategic plan, only to have those reports and plans mostly sit on the shelf till we dust ourselves off and do it all over again? There are reasons why gaining traction is so hard, and that's what I'd like to talk about next. So naming and framing and understanding barriers to adoption. So there's a statement that many of you would have heard before, and it is this, that all models are wrong, but some are useful. Now there's a similar statement that you may or may not have heard, which is related, and that is the map is not the terrain. Some maps are good, some are crap. And it's here that I want to talk about maps, because we humans at heart are map makers, and I don't mean topographic maps. We make concepts and stories about the world. Maps, if you like. And maps are not reality. They're always a simplification of reality. They're a way to make sense of the world, a way to reduce infinite complexity, gradients, and endless shades of grey into something that we can understand and something that we can work with. And our maps may or may not represent reality very well. And so, to paraphrase historian Yuval Harari, our ability as humans to create intersubjective realities, categories of things that have no independent existence except between ourselves as ideas and concepts. So things like, say, nation states, or money, or property boundaries, or even language, to basically make stuff up and agree on it is a kind of superpower, because it allows us to cooperate at the scale of billions through those shared stories and belief structures, shared maps, if you like. So intersubjective conceptual frameworks, these maps, are how we make sense of the world. It's how we navigate. But if our conceptual frameworks and our maps are a poor reflection of reality, then collective dysfunction is also inevitable, and potentially at the scale of billions. Yeah, we can collide with reality en masse. So the laws of physics don't care whether you believe in them or not, or whether you understand them. Yeah, they just are brutally consistent. The magnitude of the dysfunction that can then result is in potentially direct proportion to how poor the map is. Perhaps a more Buddhist way of saying this would be, we suffer in direct proportion to the extent that we do not understand reality. And so the thesis that I would like to put to you here is that a key part of the reason why we struggle to implement best practice environmental solutions at scale is not because we lack knowledge or because we need another report telling us what we should do, but rather it's because we have some pervasive, very outdated, and really poor maps. Now, these maps, or conceptual frameworks, create a series of interlocking barriers to adoption that you could classify in lots of different ways, and I'll classify them here simply as economic, cultural, social, political, legal and institutional, and psychological or cognitive. Now, these are all founded on intersubjective realities. They exist first and foremost in our minds as beliefs and concepts and views, yet they drive our behaviour and they spill over into the material world with profound impact. What I'd like to do is unpack some of these just a little bit, and I'll start with my favourite and perhaps what might be the number one barrier, and that is economic. Yeah, the social system that we have created that takes matter and energy and resources and converts them into exchangeable goods and services. Now, this barrier is way more than about not having enough dollars to implement the types of projects and programs that might help move us towards sustainability. It's far, far deeper than that. I'm going to start with a simple but provocative statement, and it's this. The endless growth imperative that lies at the heart of our current global economic system has created a suicide machine that, unchecked, will hollow out and destroy the foundations of our civilization as we know it. Now, the reason for this somewhat polemic statement is deceptively simple, and that is infinite growth is thermodynamically impossible in a finite system, like our planet. Yet, the way our economic system is currently constructed at its root, with the creation of credit via issuing of debt that is bound to compound interest, requires continual growth. The economy has to grow in order to keep servicing, basically, the growing debt and to not collapse. Now, obviously, capitalism goes through oscillating cycles within that, but the central imperative of growth remains. And this is why politicians, global economic organizations remain utterly obsessed with growth, because the rules that we have created require it to keep the economy stable. Yet there are no examples in nature of anything that grows endlessly, because it violates thermodynamics. All living organisms stop growing once they reach adulthood. Ecosystems likewise, once they reach natural limits. We don't have to continue growing to be stable and thriving. We can remain alive and functioning in dynamic, steady states. So a core, and I would perhaps argue almost number one challenge of our time is to change the rules of our economic system to transition it to a dynamic steady state, something that is flowing and fluxing and alive, but operating within planetary biophysical boundaries. To quote economist Kate Raworth, meeting the needs of all within the means of the planet. So a social floor and an ecological ceiling. Now, underneath this obsession with ever-expanding GDP and growth lies a map. Yeah, and it is a very poor map whose core assumptions so misrepresent biophysical reality that, of course, dysfunction ensues. Now, the neoclassical economic map or model, which is still taught in undergraduate textbooks the world over, regards the Earth as a subset of the economy, a mere source or sink for inputs and outputs, basically an externality to the main game, almost as if it's separate. Yeah. Now, this is obviously not true, right? For the economy is a thing that happens inside the Earth system, not the other way around, and it can't be decoupled in some abstract sense. Now, we could kind of get away with a bad map like this 150 years ago when we were 1 billion in number, but we cannot now. Yeah. This one thing, an economic map with an incorrect assumption at its core, is perhaps the single most significant barrier to us adopting solutions at scale, because economics influences almost everything we do. It determines how we use and how we price and how we exchange resources, matter, and energy. And the hard truth is that this is a really deeply entrenched global system beyond our individual control or even the control of individual governments. So another key barrier that we face is kind of a combination of cultural and legal, and that is our current notion of private land ownership and land tenure. Now, leaving aside the fairly obvious farce of overlaying straight lines on the world that bear no relationship to landscape biophysical realities, our very notion of land ownership, despite the fact that it's a foundation stone of capitalism, is based on a wildly incorrect conceptual map. So our notion of private land ownership could be expressed as something like, this land is mine, it belongs to me. And that notion prioritizes individual rights, without those rights being balanced by a reciprocal responsibility to country. Now, this is widely accepted convention, right? We all do it. Hop on realestate.com. It's pretty clear. Yet, from an Earth system perspective, this is a conceptual fantasy. So considering the biophysical reality of interdependence that we've just spoken about and the porous flow of matter and energy in open systems, a more First Nations perspective of this land is me and I belong to it is far, far closer to reality. At a basic level, you can argue that that's a better, more accurate map. At very best, we are temporary caretakers and custodians. The land that we own, inverted commas, was here for millions of years before us and will be here for millions of years afterwards, unless you happen to live on a Holocene floodplain. Now, as catchment and coastal managers, land tenure and the idea of private property lies at the very heart of many of the issues that we grapple with. The poor adoption rates of sustainable land management practices at scale is in many cases readily explained by the low level of relative advantage they offer to landholders, particularly in economic terms. And so this ties back into the economic system. Now, biophysical flows of matter, of nutrients, of sediment, invasive species don't magically stop at invisible made-up property boundaries because those boundaries don't actually exist. They're intersubjective realities that exist in our minds. So our attempts, therefore, to manage physical flows and off-site transfers from private property, especially effects on waterways and aquatic systems, they're often confined to fairly ineffectual laws, governance and planning controls that struggle to account for diffuse flows from private property. Now, this is why We, as a society, can dig drains through floodplain wetlands that for over 50 plus years knowingly transport hundreds of tons of sulfuric acid and toxic metals into adjacent estuaries year after year, for negligible economic gain and a very large quantum of environmental degradation. Yet even today, knowing everything we do about this issue, we still struggle to resolve it. Now, this decadal scale constipation is not due to a lack of effort by many skilled, intelligent people. It's a hard-baked consequence of dysfunctional maps, cultural, legal, and economic. Now, to be fair, there are also some really great examples of ecological restoration of acid sulfate soil wetlands at landscape scale, but in all of the successful cases that I know of, it's because the land was transferred out of private ownership, and thereby removing it from the economic system's imperative to extract wealth, and thereby enabling change at scale. So another barrier that we all know and love is political. Now, this is a really complex one that intersects with all of the others. And political barriers to the adoption of solutions can take many, many forms, and I don't have time to address them here. But there's one key misalignment deeply embedded in our political system that many of you would have thought of, and that is that of time frames. Our election cycles are short, 3 to 4 years, yet within those cycles, laws are passed and decisions are made about how our societies use and allocate resources. Now, as our footprint has expanded with our population, our laws now have consequences that extend out into timelines that our societies struggle to imagine, let alone comprehend. Political decisions that lead to species extinction are irreversible. Political decisions to unlock and burn vast fossil hydrocarbon reservoirs will have impacts on the climate and the cryosphere that will last millennia. Now, this temporal mismatch has consequence. For example, many of Earth's key temperature self-regulation mechanisms that intersect with the carbon cycle, like deep ocean circulation, various cryosphere feedback loops, silicate weathering, these all play out at temporal scales of thousands to millions of years. Yet choices that we are collectively making now will impact them. And most of us are clueless. In fact, I would argue that a lack of broad societal understanding of geological time itself acts as a barrier to the adoption of solutions, because without an accurate perspective on time, we are unable to truly comprehend the significance of the speed of our actions and impacts. We lack a reference point, if you like. Now, to give you a deep time example, the Permian mass extinction event, which was one of the largest the Earth has ever had 252 million years ago, wiped out about 90% of marine species and 70% of terrestrial species. And this was associated with a rapid rise in global temperatures due to a large increase in atmospheric CO2 over a period of about 75,000 years. Now, even though current CO2 in the atmosphere is nowhere near as high as what it got back then, the rate of CO2 increase in just the last 150 years is in the order of 10 to 20 times faster than what happened during the Permian mass extinction. Now, rates of change matter in complex systems, and if it's too fast, things just can't adapt. Now, shifting gears into subjective cultural beliefs themselves, so cultural ideas can have or act as significant barriers to adopting more ecologically aligned actions. For example, our Judeo-Christian heritage of several thousand years has promoted the idea that humans are exceptional. We have these things called souls, while all other animals and creatures do not. And so this idea affords us a special and unique place in the cosmic order, with afterlives, etc., while any being that's not a human does not. Now, one could contrast this idea with other cultural belief systems which hold the idea of animals and other living creatures as being kin or ancestors, sometimes even extending that belief into landscapes, and waterways and natural features. Now, rather than having a debate about which human-made idea is more correct, though we do know now that we share DNA with all complex life on Earth, one could skip that whole debate and approach it from a purely consequentialist point of view. What's the behavioral result of having a culture that believes X versus Y. Now, obviously, holding that we are special and separate from all other animals and creatures makes it much, much easier psychologically to exploit them, to industrially farm them, to degrade and colonize their habitats and homes, which, in an open Earth system, we are obviously interdependent with. Whereas if all other animals and creatures are regarded as kin and ancestors, as brothers and sisters, then exploitation would be like harming family. So thus, belief, regardless of whether it is made up, can act as either a powerful guardrail or enabler of certain kinds of behaviour. And beliefs have consequence, but they are often slow and difficult to change. So this brings me to the coming decades of consequence. The multiple ecological crises that we face, they're a feature, not a bug, of modern industrial civilization. Our current food, transport, energy and material systems are all extractive by design. And the momentum of our dysfunctional systems is deeply entrenched. Transforming them at scale and the speed required to avoid disruptive change will very likely be Herculean. There is enormous cultural inertia and psychological resistance to this knowledge. This is mainly because the possibility of ecological collapse just feels too big, too abstract, too frightening to fully process. In some ways, our nervous systems are not really designed to process information like this. People readily default to denial, deferral, or distraction, or the simple imperative of just paying the next bill. Now, rising wealth inequality, I think, is something that we are likely to hear much more of, and it's likely to be a significant player influencing our trajectory, as research indicates that it has during the zenith of past civilizations. Now, this is because the extremely wealthy and powerful benefit the most from the status quo, and they have a natural incentive to resist changing it, yet they exert a very large influence over politics, media, public narratives and policy. So, what the decades ahead may hold, nobody really knows, and likely scenarios fall somewhere between techno-utopia and Mad Max at either extreme. Now, obviously, there's a lot of wiggle room in the middle. Now, in dealing with this part of the talk, I decided to try to have a little bit of fun. And so I'm pretty sus on AI for a whole variety of reasons, one of which is because I probably watched too much Terminator as a kid. But in trying to have a bit of fun, I thought I would ask the robot. And so I asked this prompt, what do you rate the likelihood of humankind addressing the climate crisis without collapse of industrial consumer civilization by 2100? And note, that's quite a specific term there, industrial consumer civilization. Assign percentage likelihood to key scenarios and adjust for the US election of Trump. And so I tried ChatGPT first, and these are the results. We have descending, the outcomes or scenarios in descending order on the left, and the original and adjusted percentage likelihoods on the right. So starting off with a green transformation, one that's equitable and tech-driven, was originally assigned 10% chance, downward, adjusted downward for Trump down to 3%. A managed transition, something that's messy but stable. We managed to get there. Original was 35%, adjusted downward to 25%. Chaotic adaptation, so major disruption, partial collapse into simplification, was rated at 30%, adjusted upward to 40% for Trump. Full collapse, global civilizational breakdown, 15%, adjusted upward to 20%, and worst case runaway, existential collapse, around 5%, adjusted upward for Trump, up to 12%. Now, I did this prompt with Copilot, Gemini, and Grok, and ended up with some pretty similar categories to what you can see on the left, and quite similar percentages being assigned. Now, aside from the robot, I think, overestimating the influence of Trump, because his effect will disappear over time, I think, if nothing else, this is a pretty interesting reflection of what we think our future might hold. Because in many ways, AI and the robot is really just reflecting our own combined analysis back to ourselves. From a complex systems perspective, my best take is that we're likely to be in for a pretty rocky road over the coming decades as the consequences of transgressing multiple biophysical system boundaries increasingly take hold. The potential for unpleasantly unpredictable things to occur is going to be compounded by the force multipliers of an increasingly erratic and warming climate and a population that's moving towards 10 billion. Now, what does this mean for us as catchment management practitioners? Well, despite an increasing need for resources to be allocated to the environment, it's quite possible we may find there is actually less money to do stuff. Because unfortunately, history suggests that as economic and geopolitical crises play out, that tends to, it hits the hip pocket and fear. It tends to trump the environment. But we'll see over time how this plays out. So this brings me to the last part of this talk, navigating with sanity. And honestly, this was the hardest part of this talk to write. And mainly because I don't have any clear answers for you. I'm not sure that anybody does, because otherwise we would be adopting them. To address the barriers that I've discussed here, barriers that are rooted in long-standing beliefs and shared cultural stories and values, it takes time. It takes education and the slow, steady process of cultural evolution. Yet our best science tells us that time is not something that we have a lot of. Now, there are different views on whether looking at this crisis unflinchingly is empowering or disabling, whether we need realism or perhaps a focus on hope and optimism. Now, obviously we need both, but personally I'm a little bit suspicious of hope because it can easily morph into hopium, especially in a culture that is already conditioned to sufficient distractions and endless dopamine hits. What I do think we need, and we need lots of it, is courage. Courage to have difficult conversations about our poor maps right across all different levels of society, from barbecue through to parliament. Courage to have open, wide-ranging public discourse about the insanity of unchecked economic growth and what the alternatives might be and what they might look like. Courage to confront civilizational myths like that of separation that are no longer fit for purpose. And as practitioners, I think it's really important to realize that the intent of our jobs is almost impossible to fulfill, not because of our failure, but because of this far deeper systemic context. There are huge historical forces at play, and most of them are beyond our control. So first and foremost, I think we need to be kind. We need to have realistic expectations that account for this much bigger picture. And that doesn't mean not applying band-aids nor giving up or not fighting the good fight, but rather doing it with a wide-eyed perspective and a compassionate eye. Because good things are always worth doing, even if they might seem small. I think building and helping to strengthen local and community networks is also probably wise, because smaller scale structures may end up displaying more resilience as global scale ones begin to overstretch. And our existing institutions will probably continue to struggle to cope with what's coming. And it's already quite clear they're not designed for this level of complexity. And at times they may even do dumb things that make situations worse. And so recognizing that, it's probably smart to cultivate a pretty robust sense of humor to help one to sanely respond to the Monty Python, Yes Minister, Utopia type situations that we'll likely increasingly find all around us. And beyond that, I have no words of wisdom nor comfort, but I do thank you for your time and for your attention.